2024 seems to be going through a bit of a multiplayer game renaissance. With the huge launches of Helldivers 2 and Content Warning, the sustained prevalence of Lethal Company, and even an indie gem like Enshrouded, it's pretty stacked with games you just have to convince your friend group to play with you. Abiotic Factor has elements of almost every one of those games, yet feels quite distinct. I could point out 30 different places where ideas in it come from other games, yet it never feels cynical. Abiotic Factor is a game made of games just because it loves games. Already, I've said the G word a bit too much here. You should think about picking up Abiotic Factor, and here's why. Normally, when I play an early access title, I go in with a bit more charitability in me. I understand, due to the circumstances of its launch, that I need to cut it a bit of slack when I come across those problems. After all, putting that money down is closer to an investment to many than just purchasing a product outright. It's putting a little less cash on the table now to get something much bigger in the future, and you get the added bonus of watching the game grow while you play. However, early access can also be a risk. When you analyse it, you have to take what you have in front of you, whilst also being aware of where it will land in the future, without ever fully believing the game will make it to its endpoint until it does. Abiotic Factor hasn't just set expectations early on, but has given me a sense of fun and adventure rivaling any full release out there. You just need to be prepared for its quirks. An abiotic factor is a part of an ecosystem that affects things in the ecosystem but is not itself living. It could be your source of water to keep you hydrated, food to keep you sustained, or those little things that keep your mental health in check. It is what keeps you happy and content. Being what is essentially a mumbo-jumbo, faux scientific way of saying the things that keep you alive, this is honestly a perfect name for the game. It's a survival crafter where you play a scientist who is both trying to keep themselves alive and figuring out what is going on in the facility they have found themselves in. Though, naturally, one might want to compare Abiotic Factor to Subnautica, The Forest or Don't Starve for its story-driven elements, spooky creatures and grim aesthetic respectively, the single biggest influence here appears to be Half-Life, and Abiotic Factor thrives because of it. Starting with the textures and the general aesthetic, there's a certain polygonal charm to everything, blurry enough to let you piece in the gaps between what things look like and what they are, yet distinct enough to make out things from far away. This is key to a survival game that allows those hectic moments to feel freeing rather than oppressive. It doesn't feel like a game designed with realistic rock movement as you step on them or flashy animations to water that you wade through. It's minimalistic by design, and this allows you to pick up the language of the world almost instantly. With nothing but a very basic tutorial, you are taught that you can use nets to trap enemies, weapons to break boxes, and electricity to power the most important tools and crafting elements. Perhaps the most important thing you are taught is to attempt a way around the problems in front of you. Though not as complicated or intricate as an immersive sim, Abiotic Factor encourages you to think about your approach as you will die without proper prep work. Despite this, death isn't so punishing that you don't want to immediately get back out there and start searching once more. Just after the tutorial, but before entering a world, you have to finish creating your character by choosing their career and traits. Each career type comes with certain stat increases and even some unique items. Some classes are based on damage, while others are based on healing you and your friends. It's a fun bit of character building that not only works to explain some of the game's systems, but works especially well in multiplayer games, as it encourages players to be the guy you go to for certain skills. Why waste your time growing plants when the dedicated harvester can grow plants quicker and more efficiently? Traits range from requiring your character to go to the toilet more often, all the way to being able to drink any source of water without complications. Negative traits give you points back, which can then be spent on positive traits. Think of what it's like to build your character in Project Zomboid, and you have more or less what Abiotic Factor is going for. It's one of those systems that rewards you for going out there with your build, but I never really saw a reason to pick traits that help out with certain attributes. Most of the game's mechanics are accompanied by a leveling system, and XP can be spotted up at the top left of the screen where you do those actions. Despite your career impacting stats from the start, you can level up any of the game's main attributes by just doing the same action over and over again. This technically means you can sprint around in the same room or keep throwing the same net to level them up, but this is such a waste of your time, you might as well just earn them by playing. Abiotic Factor's survival mechanics are a game of constantly spinning plates. It's never tough enough to warrant your full attention, but just annoying and just punishing enough that you can never fully take your eye off it. In service of this, Abiotic Factor has lots of things to pay attention to that don't make much sense in a technical way, but feel designed to keep everything boiling over. You frequently have to go for bathroom breaks, complete with a minigame to ease the passage, so to speak. You also have to make sure you're washed so as to avoid getting hurt more when you take cuts. It Also has your traditional survival crafting needs to take care of, like food, water, and sleep. You soon settle into a pace, and the actual surviving element becomes much easier. This is because, at its heart, Abiotic Factor feels more aligned with an action-adventure or an RPG in its approach to the world. You are constantly left with a question in your mind, and the only way to answer that is to push further into the darkness. Gate, the entity that employs you, has a lot more going on underground than you first realise. In fact, it almost becomes too much at some points. You settle into that early game, making plans to keep your food topped up and storing water to keep you and your friends hydrated. Then a spooky monster pops up that requires much more than a bludgeoning with a weak weapon. Suddenly, crossbows are needed and you haven't quite worked out how to build them yet. Then, you have the crossbow and you need just enough resources to craft the bolts to keep yourself alive. After a little time, something more monstrous comes along and you haven't found the weapon for those 9mm bullets just yet. Then, a portal opens up and the big bad is immune to damage. You are forced into playing a game of cat and mouse with an entity too big and monstrous to really contend with. Then, you're back to base again. Adding to this gameplay loop, there's a night and day cycle to the world that means electricity turns off, it gets colder and darker. After you've figured out how to handle this, some nights are accompanied by a raid-like mechanic, forcing you to keep your base safe from approaching enemies. I have multiple times made it out of an area with just a little bit of health left, only to run into a horde of creatures outside my humble little base. This not only works well to show you how far you've come, but it allows you to put your fears into perspective once more. Suddenly, that intro feels less worrying, but the world outside your base feels so much bigger. Well, that's until you run over your buddies with a forklift. As you might be able to guess from some of the elements I've shared so far, Abiotic Factor is incredibly wacky too. It can be quite grueling when you're stuffed in a vent, but incredibly funny when you hear a friend rushing towards your base, screaming that some ungodly entity has somehow caught onto their scent and shows no sign of stopping. This is a game you don't want to be in a Discord for. With proximity chat and a built-in pages system to alert players of your location, it gives all the tools you need to find each other and just enough room to really mess up. Me and my little squadron of useless scientists set up a system where, if one person paged, everyone had to page back, as none of us could hear each other from a distance. These little barriers that you are forced to work around helps get at this central feeling I had the whole way through my time with the game thus far. I have felt constantly encouraged to think about things, but not too hard. It has this excellent ability to make you feel like a scientist from Half-Life who has somehow stumbled in on a fake CV and a little bit of charisma. Instead of getting a cushy job and a 401k, you have a whole facility full of dark secrets and just a few strange characters to piece together what's going on. Even playing alone, the world isn't totally without human life. There are central NPCs which give you your main quests, and it even pops up on the screen to keep you aware of what you need to do next. There's a genuinely intriguing world at its core, and mostly made that way through interesting monster design and fun side areas. The story itself is relatively bare bones and a little cliché in its initial approach, but fleshed out through areas I wanted to explore. Being in early access, Abiotic Factor is littered with glitches and bugs, sometimes going out of the map, occasionally entirely warping the screen until you log out and log back in, and with some items not always working as intended. None of these have been entirely game-breaking and certainly not big enough to stop me from playing the game, but still dampen the experience somewhat. When I mentioned at the start that I'm willing to be a bit more charitable to early access titles, this is part of that charitability. The game right now is playable and fun, though it does have clear technical problems that pop up frequently. As well as this, the next 8 to 12 months are said to carry with it new sections and parts of the story to explore. However, it's worth noting that there is something excellent here that you can play right now. The leveling system is not really that of a fully fledged RPG, simple stat upgrades and some basic earned traits can't entirely replace intentional builds and special moves, but it does reward you for doing the same thing 50 times. This eases some of the boredom that can come with clearing out the same camp of enemies that you just beat an hour prior. The world of Abiotic Factor regularly resets, dropping new enemies and items. As of right now, this feels like a necessary evil. The game is quite story driven in specific ways, so running into soldiers in areas that you've already cleared can not only be quite immersion breaking, but tedious and slow. And Abiotic Factor, thanks to its atmosphere and style, is genuinely quite immersive. These problems are, of course, new ways to get resources in a game that is limited in scope thanks to it all being set in an underground facility. You can't get limitless supplies of food, water and weapons, so the game needs to give you a reason to keep finding them. However, it can be unfortunate to gear up, use your resources on weaponry, go in and clear out a base of enemies, only for them to all spawn back in when you return to continue the story. This often left me and my team recklessly running into areas just to reach a stopgap on the other side. The game's portals, which send you to different areas, I'm trying not to disclose for spoiler purposes, could be a much better resource run system, encouraging players to use their own inquisitive nature to help their squad. You can of course get resources in here, but it never feels all that necessary, apart from a few key items. This also would feel more tonally appropriate for the game. Though you can pick soldier classes, you fundamentally play inquisitive people, and this is reinforced in other ways. For instance, to unlock a recipe you need to have held all the specific items that make up said recipe at some point. Then you go into a menu where you have to think up the item. This is done by slotting parts you found into places in a menu, which then, when placed correctly, will give you the recipe you need. This is a fitting little mini-game that I really like, because if you think about it enough, you can figure out which of the parts are correct based on context clues. If I have just picked up an item for the first time, and then I get the prompt to make a recipe, it must be used. Then I can figure out the other parts based on its use case. Would this contraption need glue? Probably. Could a desk leg be used to prop up part of the base of it? Yeah, I'd say so. The only way I'd like the system a little more is if it rewarded with, say, XP for creating the recipes with no failed mistakes. If your friends haven't picked up the necessary items yet, or just don't want to do the minigame, you can actually share known recipes straight from the menu, one of those fun little mechanics that drives home what you are, scientists. Abiotic Factor strikes this wonderful balance between the story elements of The Forest or Subnautica, the aesthetic of the late 90s shooters, and the hectic spooky fun of Lethal Company. Even now, over 2,000 words into talking about it, I feel like I could talk for another 2,000, about the engrossing elements of its story, the fun of its world, the many ways it enhances multiplayer, but I also don't want to totally exhaust the game. It has enough going for it to last you on your 15th hour, but you don't want to miss out on the exploration and self-discovery of figuring out all those things that make the game tick. You're a scientist after all. Get in there and get researching. Just bring a few buddies along. You'll need test subjects. Thank you so much for listening to that. I really liked this game and it was really fun to play it with some people, so I would recommend doing that. Thank you, Abigail and Tom, for playing with me and letting me murder you for experiments. If you like this and you want to hear more reviews, essays, all kinds of things, please do subscribe. I have this goal in my head to try and hit 500 subscribers this year, which right now feels quite lofty. If I even just get a few from this, that would really, really help me make more stuff. Thank you for watching.